YouTube is figuring itself out. Okay. Looks like our meeting has started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to another Cosmos Society online open house. I'm Keith Stone, and thanks, Sarah, for unsharing the title slide. I forgot to take care of that. A research associate at the Center for Atlantic Studies, and that's our sponsoring institution for the Cosmos Society. And our guest today is Professor Carolyn Stark. We're very happy to have with us. Carolyn is an associate professor of classics at Howard University, and she earned her various and numerous degrees from Sweetbriar College, from the University of London's Warburg Institute, and from Yale University. And she's been a research fellow at the Center for Hellenic Studies, which is how we know you. Her research focuses on ancient cosmology, anthropology, ethnography, and the reception of classical antiquity in medieval and Renaissance Europe, and in Africa and the African diaspora. And in connection with that last item, I can add that, Carolyn, you have created the IO Project, an online resource for the history and reception of classics in Africa and the African diaspora. And you also have a couple of book projects underway, which I'll let people read about on our website or your faculty bio at Howard. The topic of our conversation today is the reception of classics in Renaissance Italy. And I'll turn things over to you in a second. And as I do, could I ask you to start your talk today with a bit about how you became interested in classics for the first time?
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
I started, and it was really sort of due to one of my professors, when I started at Sweetbriar, and I had taken Latin in high school dutifully and was interested in learning lots of languages, and I thought Latin would be the gateway drug for all the other Romance languages. And but she encouraged me to take Greek, and so it was really Greek that did it my first semester that I switched my major. And I also did Italian, and I studied abroad in Italy, and I became really interested in the topic that we're going to talk about today, because I kept coming across this name, the Warburg Institute, and how exciting it was. And so that's where I ended up going for my first master's, and learning about the Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance. And what really excited me about this period is what they did with antiquity. And so then I realized I could really combine my two passions. And so that is what I have done. So.
Well, thanks. Thanks. It's always good to hear those things. All right, so take it away.
Okay, so I thought maybe I would give you a little bit of introduction to how classics kind of became more and more important in Italy. And I've also chosen, I want to explain a little bit about the two authors that I've chosen and why I've chosen them. And so the Renaissance is not, the humanism starts much earlier than Petrarch, but we usually call Petrarch the father of humanism. And so you see pockets of Greek study, for example, in the 9th and in the 12th century, but it really gets going, and it's due largely to a lot of the things that we attribute to humanism is to Petrarch, and the letter that I've given you gives you a nice sense of a lot of the things that he did that encouraged the revival of classical learning in Italy. And because of his interest in and his rediscovery of some of Cicero's letters that then inspired his own letters, which is why I've given you one. And this idea that the Renaissance had of a real engagement with antiquity, that they felt that the ancient authors had something to offer to the problems of their own day. And I think that that's what really excited me about studying them, because it wasn't just to understand them in their own right, but also to see its relevance for their day. And so a lot of times the humanists weren't just scholars, but they were also diplomats and artists and poets, and scientists. And so it's a very exciting period, and you can really see the interconnections. And so that's partly. So maybe I'll give you a little bit more when we talk about each one with the study of Greek and with Petrarch. But is that enough of an intro, or would you guys like a little bit more of like, what is humanism? A lot of it we think of as like the gathering of the manuscripts. So you think of the famous manuscript hunters. We've heard a lot about Poggio Bracciolini, who during the Council of Constance discovered like Lucretius and Manilius in 1417.
I actually haven't heard a lot about this
Poggio?
person and
Okay.
this discovery. So yeah, could you briefly, what is this discovery?
Well, so well, then maybe I should back up then. So the letter that we looked at today is one of the letters to the ancients that Petrarch writes, and these letters that he writes, and they are like Cicero and Seneca and Pliny, like these are meant to be published, and so they are very they're very loaded with a lot of
it's really a letter to one's contemporaries in a way.
Exactly. And there's a lot of allusions that his friends would have known, and so he had a correspondence, of course, with Boccaccio, and so it's so in fact some people have argued that that's who wrote him the letter, purportedly from Homer, from the underworld. And so anyway, it gives you kind of a nice sense of how they wrote back to each other and pushed each other on certain key elements that they were interested in. And so Greek learning was harder to come by. I mean, so Petrarch learned a little bit from Bernardo Bellarmine, and then this also, a lot of the Greek learning that happened in Italy came from Greek scholars. I mean, Bernardo was an Italian scholar who went to Greece and then came back with that learning. But a lot of times they would come over for the reconciliation between the Greek church and the Roman church. And with it came like the talks that they would give, and then they would teach the Greek and the manuscripts. Now there is a lot of manuscripts of Greek, obviously, in Sicily and southern Italy, and some pockets of Greek remain there. And so that's, so I don't want to make it completely bereft, but it is due to these figures that then made Greek learning more accessible. And another one that we'll talk about a little bit more with Ficino is when they had the council a couple of centuries later in Ferrara, when Gemistus Plato gives the lectures on Plato in Florence and brings Platonism more to Florence. And so how's that? Is that better? But I mean, a lot of it is like they start reading and they start learning, and then they want to find and recover things. And so they started acquiring. And even though Petrarch didn't have much Greek and couldn't really read his Greek authors, he still had copies of Plato on his shelf and Homer, and had this kind of longing to read them and communicate with them.
I have books in English on my shelf that I haven't read. But so something even like the New Testament, which is written in Greek and pretty easy Greek generally, in the West or in Italy, they weren't studying in Greek.
Well, we have,
they didn't know Greek, so they were studying in Latin.
Right. So there is, so that is, we have manuscripts, biblical manuscripts from the 9th century that have the dual, and it's clearly from a Latin writer who's doing the Greek. And so there, but a lot of it is much later where it becomes, and you can see even the early translations of the humanists and this gets into what I think Petrarch is also hinting at in his letter about theories of translation, and so that they would do like the Wehrbom, the sort of the word for word, and they would write the equivalent underneath it. And as you know, that doesn't, I don't know if you, I've seen students, I always discourage like them doing that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think that's a great intro. Does anyone have any questions at the moment? Yeah, Sarah, go ahead.
So at that point, they would have been fairly or relatively familiar with the Latin authors, but the thirst was to encounter the Greek authors or Greek texts in the original language. Is that
right? And even have access to a lot of the Greek ones in Latin translations, because so we have, like, Chalcidius has his of Plato, Timaeus, right? And then in the 12th century, we have Henricus Aristippus's Meno and Phaedo. So those are translated, but they're very literal and they're clunky. And part of one of the humanism is all about eloquence, and Cicero plays a really important role. And so, like, I love, there's an anecdote that Petrarch gives that, you know, his father sent him and he was supposed to be a lawyer. And this kind of resonated with me too, because I thought that's what I was going to do as well. And so that in his father's rescued the Virgil and Cicero from the fire. And because he was crying, and because he was spending too much time reading classics, and so threw them into the fire. And anyway, so yes, so I think that there's this idea of translation that comes about that's more than just it's one thing to have a literal translation when you're learning a language, but then also to aspire to something beyond that. And then also out of that comes this idea of what we call imitatio. And so this idea of how do we make the authors our own and build on them. So we have the famous quote of Petrarch that's, you know, that we're on the shoulders of giants. So you probably heard that in others, but they didn't, Petrarch. So anyway.
Aileen, sorry, I was taking a note. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Caroline, to introduce us to that wonderful author, Petrarch. Thank you so much. I have a question about, you know, I was reading the beginning of his letter to Socrates, and which is a very lovely letter to Socrates. And I was thinking, do you think that Petrarch is looking at these old Greek authors because he wants to find ideas to move to a foundation for a better world?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a huge part of what the humanists are about. And I mean, it's nice because the letter that I've given you gives you a flavor of how he really felt like he was summoning the ancients, kind of like a him would, an ancient hymn, you know, to his presence. And we have that famous letter also from Machiavelli and to Vittori, where he goes into his study and he feels like he's in communing with the ancients. And I think that that's part of what's going on, that and to talk about them and have them as interlocutors to these ideas that they're exploring. And I think that they really did feel like this was the key to making it a better world. And I think Petrarch has a lot more of the sense of, I'm surrounded by ignorance, and, you know, and so he needs these interlocutors. And you get more into the humanism, and it's much more about, like, you know, I think especially with Ficino, like he just throws himself into Platonism as he sees like a real answer to his faith, and so I think that's a really exciting move. But you see it also in the political works, and so it's very intermingled in terms of the poetry and the philosophy and religion and politics, and they take from everywhere. So it's really exciting as a classicist because they don't cite. So you have to know the authors that they're talking about in order to really see what they're doing with it. It's really fun.
So what do you think about the lack, I think, of historical perspective? Because I think they treat the ancients as if they were their contemporaries. So is it that something that they are looking for something, for some aim, for example, for a kind of symbolic or more analogical reading of the ancients than historical, with a historical perspective?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that there is, I mean, because Petrarch, the reason why he sees it is he sees that there's a real break between his period and antiquity, but it's sort of bridging that divide and trying to turn away from what they call the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, you know, to kind of bringing back the good things about antiquity and moving forward with it. So it's not just I think that's why I was saying, like, it's not just understanding them in their own right, but also saying what can we take from the past and build on that. And I think that was a huge part of what they did. So, but the humanism is not just textual. I mean, obviously, I kind of focused on that because of the literary and the philosophical things that I've picked. But in the prepared intro, I sort of had much more about how you see it in all aspects, particularly like architecture and arts and the studying, and they were digging up things and this interest in antiquarianism. So there is a real kind of desire to understand it in its own right too. But I think it goes alongside with this idea of its contemporary relevance. And I think so, but that's a great question.
Thank you.
So there was an archaeological aspect to this as well. I'd always thought of it as, you know, recovering texts in various ways, but they were also digging. I mean, you used that word, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, you can go, they have the graffiti on the walls of the Domus Aurea where you see the artists have lowered themselves down to study the paintings. And then you see the influence in it in the chapels in Rome. So it's really kind of exciting to see how they really did just kind of steal what they could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Ian. Oh, you're muted.
Yes, thank you so much. I would very much like to hear your prepared intro if you're willing to present it.
Sure. So if that gives you guys a little bit more of a grounding, because so I'm happy to do that. So we just thought maybe it would be more off the cuff and but I can. So some of it I have talked about. Sorry?
Maybe since we're getting on here in our hour, maybe some highlights from
it. Okay.
From it.
So I think that one of the things that let's see, I'm sorry, I'm just skimming it now because I think one of the things that's really interesting about what we were talking about with the book hunters, with Petrarch and then Poggio when he goes to the Council of Constance between 1414 and 1418, and recovers a lot of the lost works. And then we have several popes that also put in, to build the Vatican Library, which housed a lot of these. And then Bessarion has another important collection of Greek manuscripts in Venice, which with the recent flooding, everyone's freaking out about. And so anyway, but so I think that but I'll do the part about so one of the things that I think is important that we'll talk about with Ficino, and I can start a little bit more with this, is that when Gemistus Plato came, and then there's the real start of Neoplatonism in Italy was like when Arispa and Traversari brought a complete manuscript of Plato's dialogues to Italy for the first time in 1423. And so that was kind of a landmark event. And then also this church council that I mentioned in Ferrara in 1438 is when it sort of spurred on Cosimo de' Medici to commission Ficino to translate the entire dialogues of Plato. Now, as he was starting that, the works of Hermes Trismegistus, and I don't know if that is from a name familiar to you with the Hermetic text. Okay, some of you are nodding. So they thought at the time that was even earlier, and so Cosimo asked Ficino to set that aside and do the Hermetic text first, and so he did that, and then he came back to Plato. So he didn't finish all of Plato before Cosimo died, but he translated all of Plato, and then later he translates Plotinus. So he was a very important Greek translator, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about him and what he did with Plato. But that was published. The entire dialogues were translated and published in 1484. But Ficino also had an interest in astrology, so that was a significant astrological date as well, but I won't get into that. I can say that for another time. But another, and you've probably heard of this press, but Aldus Manutius set up the famous Aldine Press in Venice, which began to publish Greek works in 1494, with some of the first printings being editions of Aristotle in 1495 and the 9 comedies of Aristophanes in 1498. And so I think that's an important press, and those are important dates to be aware of. It's important too to realize, as Cosimo, as a patron of humanists, that these kinds of courts had circles of humanists, and so important centers are then Florence with the Medicis, Naples for Alfonso and Ferrante the First, and of course Rome with the papacy once it leaves Avignon. I mean, Petrarch, it's in Avignon, so Italy is very much wilderness in his mind and needs to be revitalized. And also and for like more Republican centers, you have Venice and so those are earlier centers are like Padua and Ferrara, and so that's where you see a lot of the Seneca, the Latin. But I was trying to focus on more of the Greek for you guys. So okay, so sorry, I'm trying not to read and yet pick up the important things that you wanted to know, but I think that it was really of the different popes that are important for this, because this is again, they really kind of got an industry of translators to then go through and translate the Greek works, and this was really important. So I mean, another choice I could have done was Lorenzo Valla, who's another really important philologist in this time period. But I would say that it's like Nicholas V and then the Della Rovere popes, and but so. And he was Nicholas V in 1447 is when he came to the papacy, and he, because of the value of the humanists and their role in these negotiations with the Eastern churches and in the papal curia, he employed a lot of the humanists to translate the Greek works into Latin, and they were really important at those councils. They're called the Unionist councils at Ferrara and Florence in 1439. And so he sent emissaries all throughout Europe and the Mediterranean to get these manuscripts. And the ones rescued from Constantinople. So this is one way. We also have a lot of emigres that flee Constantinople and take the books with them. And so he created a scheme for rebuilding Rome, and he's the one who founds the Vatican Library. And then with the fall in 1453, the energies of the next two popes were focused largely on the Crusade. So that kind of hijacks some of the agenda a little bit. that from just the acquiring of books. And then we have the Aeneas Sylvius Piccolomini, who becomes Pius II. And he's an important humanist, but when he becomes Pope, he again gets kind of drawn into a lot of the politics around the kind of consolidating to turn to protect the incursions from the East. So that's sort of so it really, even though he was an important humanist, it really is the Della Rovere popes where then they can consolidate power, and without going into a lot of the politics of the time, that they could really focus on the building programs that they did. And so like the Sistine Chapel and all the bridges and restoring of churches and those things are due to these later popes that are building on this and encouraging the classical antiquity. So yes, I don't know if, I mean, I have much more, but I just didn't want to get into necessarily the art, architecture, and music unless you wanted to. But those are sort of, I think, highlights.
That's
And
quite a bit. So we could focus on the text maybe, I suppose. Okay. But I see now that I'm back in gallery view that some of you have questions. Kat, yours was the first hand that I saw.
My question is, these manuscripts were translated into Latin, is that right? Not Italian?
Well, so Ficino's, so what I've given you, he did it first in Latin, and then he immediately did his commentary into Italian.
Okay.
So, so there were translations that a lot of times the vernacular translations were made from the Latin rather than from the Greek. So again, it's sort of when you're looking at the transmission history or even reception history of this period, it's really important to look across the languages. I mean, because for example, even as early as Dante, with something like Ovid, he could read Latin. So is he using Ovid's text, or is he using the Italian translation and the scholarly works around it, or both? I mean, because we do as well, right? Sometimes we come to the ancient text first through a translation. And
right, I was going to ask about Dante. But the other thing is, were these translations literal or elegant, which is the word I want to use for, some making it actually work in Latin as opposed to being plodding along?
Right. I think that, so that's what I think really is where Petrarch comes in, and that's the flavor of the letter that I gave you, is really about the art of translation. And it's getting beyond, he's not very generous to the translators in this inelegant and, workmanlike translations, because he was really, he draws from Seneca's ideas of the bees, and they go to the flowers and their sources and they make it into something else. And so he has that analogy. He also uses the portraits and the likeness of the father, son, which we see in the letter.
When did that begin to change? It must have been somebody who finally came along and did a good translation.
Well, I think I think the humanists tried to do good translations. And so I think, but you have to have a certain facility of the language in order to do that. And I think that that you certainly, I think one could argue that Ficino does a good job. And I think poetry is always much more subjective, but I think that the humanists, so that's sort of why I jumped time from Petrarch and what his aspirations were. And I think what he does kind of take the authors and ingest them and then make something that's his own, but you can see all the echoes. But it's and I use echoes deliberately because I think it is kind of that intertextual echo where you see Ovid, you see Virgil, you see Cicero, but it's not a direct quotation. And I think sometimes everyone wants to see that. Where is it? I don't see it, and I've done the search, but it's so there. And I think that's what they were aspiring to, is that you saw that they're in that community, but it's not a direct theft. And he even, I didn't give you this letter, but there's another letter that I love, where he really actually does that. And he says, oh, I used this line and I thought it was my own. And it's like a direct quotation from Virgil or from Ovid. And, oh, I didn't really mean to do it. It's just that it was so much, and that shows that he's totally
right. Yeah, well, of course, those are the Roman authors. But when did the Greek authors have a real impact? You talked about Platonism. Did the Iliad, the Odyssey, I mean, this Petrarch letter is addressed to Homer. What kind of impact did Homer have, if any?
I think he does. I mean, I think that you see it in this time period, but it's more, I think it's a later, I guess that this is what starts it. And of course they have to learn the Greek. And so that's also harder, given that you have to have the teacher and the pockets, and there's not all the apparatus that one needs. And so I don't know. I mean, this is you're asking a subjective question that I could be taken to task for, but I really think that this is why I picked Ficino, because I feel like this is when, I mean, Vala is another really good one that, I mean, they're reading the Greek and they understand it and they give you a translation that really captures the sense and isn't just a literal translation. And so I think you see that really in the 15th century.
Yeah, well, of course, they're very familiar with Virgil. Virgil, of course, is referring back to the Trojan War. So from that point of view, they're already immersed in the Iliad.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's what he's really saying in a lot of the letter too, that he knows him indirectly through the Roman authors.
Yeah, through Virgil, yeah.
I saw there were a couple other questions. Yeah, Georgia.
Thank you very much. I've kept some notes, so some key information that for me are very important. Mentioning of the translators, and we have to be reminded that by then Greek is a foreign language. It does not. We have a phase from the bilingual state of the Roman elite that does not exist anymore. And Greek is a language they have to learn anew. So this is where the schools start, and the grammarians, with all this migration, from the Byzantium, which leads me to the next step. This Byzantium, that's the link, the missing link for the Middle Ages, is rediscovered because of the fall eventually of the fall of Constantinople. First, the threat, the disconnection, the threat, the fall, and the reconnection. I think this is a very important aspect of, let's say, of reestablishing the Western identity through the classics, but because of the historical situation of the split, because of the fall of Constantinople. I would say that even in Petrarch, I'm not sure that I see, let's say, a continuous line of fascination with the classics. He has a turn into, then at some point he really turns his attention to the biblical sources, and then for his own reasons it becomes more important than asserting, the classics in this sense. And my last remark in the question, I don't know how true that is, but I've been reading that the Renaissance post-classical authors more read than the what we call the classics, like Plutarch or Lucian. On what base is this assumption true, or why do people claim that this is true in this sense? Thank you very much. It's very inspiring.
I'm sorry if I gave the wrong impression that it was a continuous tradition.
Perhaps I understood it wrongly. Sorry.
So, I mean, I guess to your, I didn't, was there a question in the second comment?
Yeah, that whether you find the historical connection as important. It's not that, and actually, because the migration you mentioned, it's not coincidental that the revival is connected to the migration, because the scholars come and bring the text as well. But there is a kind of a moving over from East with the text, with let's say the tradition.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think Petrarch is I hate to make generalizations, because even in the religious texts, there are elements where he's clearly using ancient authors in the way that he writes. So for me, it depends on the degree of how much of an influence, like what I was saying about the echoes. I think that he imbibes it and it's a part of who he is. And I think Christianity, I think all that is very present. And I mean, so I've also picked Ficino for those reasons, because he's almost like a Christian Platonist rather than a Platonizing Christian. And I think that that's kind of an interesting. So I think that they are kind of trying to say, how does this fit into their life? And I think in the 15th century, it's very exciting because it's a lot more fluid. And this is before the Inquisition comes and things get very dangerous. And then there's a lot more sub rosa. They have to do a lot of rhetorical distancing from antiquity. And so I think in this sense, like that, yes, I think that trying to understand how Christianity fits into antiquity and the syncretism that we see in Plato, I think is true of some of the humanists, but not all of them. I mean, and that's why some of them are accused of being almost heretical, and so I think that so I don't know. I think that the Petrarch question, I think, I mean, I think I see it. I think his interest in antiquity is there, and it's sometimes it's indirect, sometimes it's through Augustine. I mean, what you call post-classical authors. I mean, I always, I don't know about those terms, but in terms of the popularity of certain authors, this is getting to your last question, I think changes obviously in different periods. And Ovid is very important in the Middle Ages. And I would say he's kind of have a resurgence now, but he kind of went dormant there for a little while. I mean, dormant, but not as popular as he was then. And so I think that the idea that Plutarch is very important in the Renaissance is absolutely true. I mean, in Valerius Maximus, some of these authors that we don't read, I mean, the fact that one of the authors I'm very interested in is Manilius and his Astronomica, when it's rediscovered in 1417. And that was hugely influential in 15th century, because astrology was a part of their lives in a way that nowadays, people don't really see the interconnections. But I mean, Ficino, his father was a doctor. And he writes something that he gets some blowback from, but he writes also an astrological work, the De Vita. And it's like, and so that I think, I don't know. So I think that authors come in and out, and I think that's why it's important to sort of read very widely and to sort of also read what they read. So. Yeah.
Jenna, I just saw your hand go up.
Thank you.
Please.
When these translations were done, who were the consumers of these translations? For whom they were done?
Well, I think that, I think that there were a lot of humanists who wished their Greek were better, particularly earlier. And so I do think that some of the translations, but at the same time, you see the influence, like of Ficino's translation of Plato. Another reason why I chose him, not only was he important in the 15th century, but even beyond that, because then they didn't necessarily go back to Plato and then the Greek, but he was much more influential through his Latin translation. So if you look in Spencer, and people have looked at all these different literary figures that have read the Symposium and read Ficino's work in Latin. And so a lot of times, unless you have some figure like Erasmus where they have this facility of both languages, a lot of times, even if they could read the Greek, they do use translations as well. And so I think it depends on the human. It depends on the humanist and what their purpose was.
I mean, were there schools to use them, or for education of the royals? Because if they become popular, that means that somebody is using them, consuming them. And another question, they look towards east. Did they look towards west to translate? So it's only Byzantium influence, or would they be influenced from, let's say, antiquity from England?
I think that that's a good question. I think that, okay. Sorry, and your first question was, I've lost it already.
Were the translation used for education?
Oh yes, okay. So sorry, I was like, I knew I had. So a lot of times the humanists were the tutors of the princes, and they could exert a lot of influence that way. A lot of the some of the presentation copies are the beautifully illuminated ones are presented to their patron, but whether they actually read it or not, I think it really depends on the patron. Some of them knew that it was important, but some of them were more really avid, and like, so the one of the famous ones is like Federico and Urbino, and he had a studiolo with the portraits of the ancients, and so he was very interested. Another one was Alfonso that I've mentioned before, and down in Naples, and that's where like Vala would have those famous fights in the court, you know, because their prominence in the court and their livelihood was also like the showing off in front of their patrons and competing in a way. It gets more vicious in the 16th century, but it definitely happens in the 15th as well. And so I think that, so there are, but at the same time, the other question you were like asking, so that has to do with patrons and the humanists. But in terms of making it more accessible, once the press comes in, then that makes it much more affordable. I mean, I think that's perhaps something I should have started with too. Like, to own a manuscript is very expensive, and so once the printing press comes in and the incunables, it's still expensive, but it's much more affordable. And so they would copy out and they would share, and that's partly a lot of what we have are these copies of humanists. Once they discovered it, they'd copy it out, and they'd borrow and they'd copy it out and write all over it in the marginalia, which is not pretty presentation, but it gives you a lot of insight into what they were thinking and how they were understanding the authors. And so some of the more important commentators of really those commentaries, those early commentaries, are based on their lectures that they gave at the university. So like, so Plato that I mentioned did lectures in Florence. One of the authors I'm interested in, humanist, is Bonincontri, and he did the first commentary on Manilius, and those were based on his lectures that he did in Florence. And so they did do these public lectures on the ancient authors, and then that ended up being a lot of times these commentaries that were attached to them. So I do think that they had a wider influence than the people who could actually read and study the language the same level.
To the point about readership, how about the church? Why was the church translating these? Were they using them for their own education, theological developments?
A lot of the things with the popes, I think, go back depending on the pope. So I sort of focused on the more humanist-friendly popes, but there were times where you had a very hostile pope, and imprisoned several humanists for their the famous Roman Academy, and getting locked up for many years. I mean, because they were doing these pagan rites, and this is when they were trying to redo in the catacombs these meetings that they would have. So it really depends on the popes. But did these ancient texts influence theology? Absolutely. but it's also that kind of turn in the universities too, from the Aristotelianism and the introduction to other ideas. And that's another reason why the Plato influence is interesting in that way.
May I just weigh in before I say goodbye to everyone to catch my flight? I think what Carol wonderfully has said is I wouldn't put it like that the ancient Greek fell into disuse. For me, it would be more methodologically correct to say that what mattered, especially during Middle Ages, is the focus of the readers, the scribes, and the scholars. Because, for example, as Carol said, for example, the focus was on Aristotle, but somehow they managed to read Plato through translations. So we need, in a way, to find some kind of path, to find the paths of readership in order to realize that ancient Greek language, reading ancient Greek texts followed a different path, which was much different than the straightforward path that were used during, for example, classical antiquity or Hellenistic antiquity. Texts, especially during this Byzantium, Eastern Roman Empire, and Western, follow different paths. So, okay, so bye everybody. I hope to see you soon, everybody. Okay?
Bye.
Thank you very much, Carol. That was wonderful.
Yes, Miriam.
Thanks. Hi. I have a question about something you mentioned when you were answering George's question to do with the sort of tension between Christian and pagan, and you mentioned something about rhetorical distancing that the translators would use. And I was wondering if you could go into more detail about that and sort of what strategies they use to sort of separate themselves from the ancients, and if you ever come across anything further than that that sort of deliberately obscures the content and would cross over into something like censorship.
Well, okay, so the example that comes immediately to mind, and again, we have Ficino, so is Lucretius. So he writes a commentary on Lucretius, and famously, he writes that he burns this commentary, and so because it gets associated with well, the mortality of the soul, and so I think that. In some ways, you know, again, after his astrological text is ill received, then, you know, that I think that that this is another one of his distancing in a way, but this is kind of early still, because I think it's also a signal of, I'm mentioning it to you though. I wrote a commentary. So you see Lucretius throughout Ficino's work and his influence. And so that's kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you know what I'm talking about. And you see it, so I think, I don't know, Lucretius is the easiest one for me to pinpoint in this regard, because they will, a lot of times the prefatory material will tell you how beautiful the language is and the purple passages and the poetry is just, we have to preserve it for these reasons, right? Oh, but we don't, you know, subscribe to, of course, you know, the mortality of the soul, and, you know, this is a mystery, a divine mystery, and so I'm going to stop right here and not explore further. And there are some humanists that go a little bit further than that, and then they just kind of stop and just leave it. And so anyway, so this is why I think the 15th century is much more exciting, because they play with it way more. But once you start imprisoning people and burning people at the stake, and poor Bruno, you know, like, then it's a lot more, even more kind of distancing. And this becomes true even with texts that engage too freely, like Machiavelli, you know, and then you have all this distancing with even his own works. And so it's not just ancient authors, but so that's the one that immediately comes to mind, and it has to do with one of our authors.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Bill, I saw you had a question too, if it's still relevant.
Yeah. Hi, Carolyn. I'm sorry I didn't ask this question when you first brought it up a long time ago. You mentioned the translation of the Emerald Tablets, Hermes Trismegistus.
Oh, the Hermes Trismegistus. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So How influential was that document at the time?
Oh, the Corpus Hermeticum? Oh, very influential. I mean, I think
Really?
that, I mean, because they really thought that, oh wow, this is even before Greece. This is, you know, the wisdom of Egypt. And so like, I think that they, so you see a lot of Hermeticism in these Neoplatonic works, I think, in Ficino's circle. So it's absolutely really important to, and I think it only gets discredited much later. So I think
so that explains a lot of the mysticism that came out of thought in that period. Okay, thank you. I always saw it as some little side document nobody ever paid attention to. I didn't realize how significant it was.
Yeah, no, it definitely was. I mean, there's a lot of things about the Renaissance where I think it makes so many things, like it's like the missing puzzle. It's like the missing piece of the puzzle. So
thank you.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our hour. Carolyn, I wonder if you could take us through anything you wanted to mention in particular about the passage from the symposium.
Oh, okay.
Before we end.
Yeah, I mean, I could do the different highlights I have of both. I mean, I think that I sort of talked about with the Ficino anyway, the syncretism that he tries to do. And I picked the Aristophanes speech because it's so striking to me how he deals with Aristophanes. And I think Keith may have mentioned that I'm obsessed with anthropologies. And so here we have an anthropology and how it's received into the Renaissance. And I think this also speaks to one of Miriam's, your question, I think, about how do we deal with these texts sometimes, like the allegorization of them is one of the ways, but that happens also in the Middle Ages. So we read Ovid because of his valuable allegories. And so I think what he does here with the three different, the male, the female, and the male-female original humans, that is really interesting, how he changes that to that body soul duality, and then the return to your other self is this divine self, you know. And so it's very, and then it represents the virtues of courage and justice. And so I thought that was a real kind of interesting way to introduce you to how they're dealing with a lot of clearly what we would, I mean, because we use this right now for LGBTQ issues to look at the Aristophanes symposiums. It really resonates with my students today. And so I can pull out Ficino. It's like, okay, look, you know, there's another way of dealing with it. But I think that one and the soul's ascent to God. I mean, I think a lot of this explains, like, because he has his Theologia Platonica that he comes out with, and so the reception of Plato and the Renaissance, I think Ficino is a good gateway to understanding how influential that is, and the importance of aesthetics and love and beauty in that is, you see that in this speech as well. So I think those were sort of the big ideas, but obviously the frame of it is beautiful, and the fact that he kind of also makes it a symposium on what they thought was the birth death date of Plato, and it's of the humanist of his time. And he has the poet Landino doing Aristophanes the poet, and so this is typical, and Petrarch is doing similar things when he does his letters. And you mentioned the Socrates letter, like that's his nickname for one of his best friends. And so like that's kind of interesting how they did that. So I don't know if I have time to say anything about the Petrarch letter either, but I think that do I, Keith? Sorry.
I would say go for it.
Go for it. Okay.
Yes.
But I mean, just to tie the two together, because I think that they're also writing themselves in it. And so this kind of brings together the sort of not only the understanding, so he's translating, and then he's writing this commentary, and he's writing himself into it. That's Ficino. And same with like what Petrarch is doing by responding, and notice it's a reply to Homer, right? Which I thought was just brilliant, right? It's like, so he's already putting himself as an interlocutor with Homer, but it's initiated by Homer. So it's also this idea of his own legacy and his own connection to them. And so that's part of also their writing themselves in the space and talking about the questions that they have and that they don't really know and that they wish they could ask them, you know, and that, why won't you tell me about your birthplace and about the number of texts, and is this story about your death really true, you know? And so that, I think a lot of these kind of lingering questions, they spurs them on to find out more, and when they recover texts and then they share, and it's all a part of how this kind of community and the interest in antiquity kind of grows. And yeah, and I think the other thing is that imitatio, and then it becomes not just the image, and this is where we see in the translation, from the literal translation to something that it becomes a poem in its own right. And I think this first translation that he's talking about, Leonzio Pilato's translation, is a prose one of Homer, and so obviously he wants something that's poetic. And I think that that imitatio and what they then call is emulatio, when they can really not just imitate but rival their models. And I think that both Ficino and Petrarch are trying to do that in these works, so that Petrarch, you know, in the letters and sort of telling Homer things that he wouldn't know, and then with Ficino sort of saying, well, I have received Christianity, so this received knowledge, divine knowledge, makes me a better Platonist, because they didn't know this. And so I think that they have that, these captures a lot of, I think, the spirit of these Renaissance humanists.
Well, thanks. That was great. That was a really great introduction to lots of these things. Are there any other questions before we go?
I saw a hand. Jack, did you have a question? No? Okay. Sorry. It was a waving.
Okay. All right. Well, Carolyn, thanks again so much for joining us. And thank you all for participating in this little meeting. And to all of you out there, thank you as well. So see you all next time.